Well, welcome to It's an Inside Job BiteSize Fridays, your weekly dose of resilience, optimism, and well-being to get you ready for the weekend. Now, each week, I'll bring you insightful tips and uplifting stories to help you navigate life's challenges and embrace a more positive mindset. And so with that said, let's slip into the stream. Today, we are diving back into the archives into Season 4, Episode 23. And in this bite-sized episode, we are going to do a little dive into the essential eternal conversations that we have with ourselves that must occur before any effective negotiation, mediation, or difficult conversation. Now, my guest, Moshe Cohen, highlights that the most crucial negotiation often happens within ourselves before we even sit at the table. He explores how internal narratives such as self-doubt or fear of conflict, how they can undermine our ability to communicate effectively. We're going to uncover the importance of self-awareness, managing these internal dialogues, and of course, the strategies to ensure they don't sabotage our external interactions. So I think this episode is for you if you are negotiating for a bump in your salary, you're mediating some sort of conflict between departments, your colleagues, or you're simply trying to have a difficult conversation. I think understanding the stories you tell yourself can make all the difference. And that's what this week's episode is going to address. So without further ado, let's slip into the stream. From what I also listened and read in your book is that we have to have two conversations when it's a difficult conversation or a negotiation or mediation, whatever word we want to use. The major one is the one we have to have with the other person on the other side of the table in the room. But the first one is with yourself. It's trying to find the self-confidence and the courage to actually have these difficult conversations. And perhaps we could spend some time sort of exploring that and understanding sort of the internal weather system, the internal mechanisms that go in our own head, and try to get on top of that through the practice of, we can call it self-awareness, or being in the here and now with our thinking and our emotions and our behavior.
So I completely agree with you. I don't know if I would even say that the primary conversation is the one across the table. I think too often the thoughts that we have and the process we go through in our own minds dominates and actually prevents us from having that conversation across the table. If you think about, someone going to negotiate for something that makes them anxious. Let's say I'm going to approach my manager for a promotion or a raise, or I'm going to approach my landlord to ask for let's say a rent reduction. Those conversations that I have in my head before I even approach the other person are sometimes so pervasive that they prevent me from even getting to the table. So if I think, my manager, is going to get angry with me for asking for this now, or my manager's not going to like me, or somehow I might get punished for this, or maybe I'm just not ready yet. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe, everybody else doesn't think that I'm as good as I think I am. So many conversations like this in our own minds prevent us from even approaching our manager. So we never have that primary negotiation to begin with. So it's really important for us to become more aware of what we're saying to ourselves as we start even thinking about going to negotiate, and to manage those internal conversations. So not only can we start negotiating, but so we don't sabotage ourselves as we do it.
And, when people going into a difficult conversation, a lot of their times, their focus, their attention is wrapped up sort of sometimes externally, like where they're cognizant, they're wrapped up externally as to, okay, I want to be honest and I want to be benevolent. And how do I balance these two sort of moral imperatives? But sometimes, from my experience, they lose track of actually what's, as you called it in the book, the narrative that's running in the background of our heads, that's driving our emotions, that are driving our behavior. Is this something that you experience? People are so occupied with the conversation or how to deal with the conversation, they don't even realize the internal narrative that's driving their emotions and their behavior?
Yeah, I think you hit on something huge. As prevalent and as important those internal narratives are, we're often not aware of them. We are telling ourselves a lot of these things subconsciously because we are so focused externally. but in the background, they're undermining our ability to be effective. So, for example, if I think of myself as a nice person, but I'm also a manager, and I have to give one of my direct reports a difficult performance review where I have to tell this person that they've done some things poorly and they need to up their game. If the whole time I'm thinking, I'm a nice person and I don't want to hurt this person's feelings, I might not be aware of that, but it might cause me to, for instance, not say some things I should say, or soften what I say in a way that the other person doesn't even understand that I'm criticizing them. Or at the first sign of emotional reaction from them, back off and not press my point. And might not be aware that I'm driven really by these internal narratives, but they're there and they're running the show a lot more than my conscious brain is.
So I guess that begs the question, how does one become cognizant or aware of their own narrative? I mean, where do we start to sort of, I don't know, unwind things, to unpack this thing we call the narrative? And maybe could we start describing what actually a narrative is in our head and how it shows up from your experience?
Yeah, so I think as human beings, we tell ourselves stories all the time. Human beings tell themselves stories all the time. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves. We tell ourselves stories about the other party, and we tell ourselves stories about the situation. So, for example, if I'm negotiating with a vendor, I might be saying to myself, we are a big company. This vendor is lucky to do business with us. That might cause me to be very arrogant or hardline in this negotiation. I might be saying, this vendor has a really hot commodity and they're not going to negotiate their price. And now I might be talking myself out of even trying to negotiate the price. I might be talking about the situation. I might say, well, there's a shortage in the market for this vendor's goods, and I might be lucky to even get the goods, let alone be able to negotiate favorable terms. So we tell ourselves these stories all the time, and these stories have a profound impact on how we feel, what we do, and how we interact with other people. And the way to get a handle on our narratives, because, I'm not naturally very self-aware. I wish I could tell you that I came from this incredibly emotionally self-aware kind of place, but I didn't. The word my wife used to describe me for a long time was oblivious. And if she were here, she probably would still use that word, but she's downstairs. So the way you need to do it is you need to find opportunities to stop and slow down during and in the middle of the process. Because what I find is, for example, when I'm coaching people in their negotiations, a lot of times I'll say, all right, let's stop. What are you telling yourself right now? Now, in that case, they have the luxury of having someone like me actually telling them to stop and asking them that question. But theoretically, there's no reason why we can't do that to ourselves. So one of the things that helps is if you promise yourself and schedule breaks during the negotiation where you can step away from the table and actually think about things like, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What am I telling myself right now? And then once you become more aware of your narrative, more aware of the stories you tell yourself, then you put yourself in a position where you can start managing those stories. You say to yourself, what is the impact of what I'm telling myself? What do I actually know? What data do I have? That's become one of my favorite questions lately. So when someone tells me their story, they say, oh, this person will never agree to blah, blah, blah. I'm like, all right, what do you actually know? And it turns out, most times, we actually know very little. And we take little bits of data that we have, we connect the dots with a whole lot of assumptions and imagination, and then we build our stories on top of those assumptions. And when you stop and ask yourself, what do I actually know? Very often you realize that a lot of the story you told yourself was just pure fiction. And then the last part is, it's your narrative. these stories exist entirely in your own mind. So that's actually a good thing, because since you own them, you get to change them. So for example, if I go to negotiate with a very large company, some of my clients where I do training are, 30, 40, 50,000 person companies. I'm a company of one person. And I could very easily go into that negotiation thinking, I'm just the little guy. I'm going to have to accept whatever contract they send me. Well, if that's my story, I'm done. I have no ability to negotiate anything. But I could also approach that situation saying, there's thousands of negotiation teachers in the world. And of all of those teachers, they picked me. And that must mean they want me, which gives me some leverage here. And it's okay for me to negotiate terms that are favorable. And in fact, if I don't do that, they shouldn't have any respect for me because I'm teaching them negotiation. And with that narrative in mind, I'm now really motivated to try to negotiate favorable terms. Nothing's changed except the narrative.
That's interesting because if we rewind back, what I hear is it's almost the to be form. It's a label at the heart of the story that we are relating to ourselves, to the world around us, or to the negotiation, whether it's power dynamics or whatever it is. What I hear is to be, I am, ... And it sounds like what we label ourselves from what you're saying, that will trigger our emotions. For example, that will trigger self-confidence or self-doubt. That will trigger us as powerless or being in power or having some influence. And then that in itself triggers the behavior. So the head leads to the heart, which leads to the hand. And so is this what you're saying? Part of the narrative is sometimes understanding how we finish the sentence, I am, in a particular situation if we're going into a difficult conversation?
Absolutely. As I say, I think it's a little broader than that because I think it's I am, but we also have stories about the other person and we have a story about the situation. So it's not just I am, it's this person is and the situation is. Because when you think about it, sometimes it's not I am, it's a seller's market. Right? That's not about me. That's just about the market. It's still a narrative that impacts my behavior. So yeah, very much so. I think the biggest part of the story is the I am, which I really like that you brought that up. But you shouldn't neglect those other stories because sometimes we're so focused on this person, right? Oh, my boss is a tough negotiator. Well, you just psyched yourself out, but it's not about you. It's about them.
Yeah, because those narratives actually become the rules of engagement we set up for ourselves. And as you said at the top of this conversation, if we're not cognizant to the narratives we're telling ourselves or the rules we're setting up, then we will play by those rules, whether it enables us or disempowers us. And so what I hear you saying, Moshe, is there's sort of almost, if I get nuts and bolts, just to sort of be a little reductionist here, is there's the I am story, the labels we give to ourselves. There is the this person is story. Again, another to be form. And the third story may be the situation. The situation is manageable. The situation's unattainable or whatever it is. So these are almost three stories. And so when you are working as a coach or as a professor or as a sparring partner or as a negotiation professional, is this part of the DNA you help people to kind of stop up and say, okay, wait, what's the meaning you're giving to the situation or what's the labels? Is this how you break it down? It's
one of the tools. Yeah, it's one of the tools that we talk about because people, in order to negotiate effectively, you need to prepare, you need to come into the negotiation knowledgeable, you need to have skills, but you can't use the information you prepared and you can't use your skills if you're constantly undermining yourself by responding more to the stories in your head than to what the other person's saying or doing. So yeah, a lot of what I talk about with people is understanding what is going on in their minds on their side of the table so it doesn't become an obstacle, and then they can use all of their skills in preparation to negotiate as effectively as possible across the table. So, negotiation like many things for humans, is actually a very highly emotional process. We don't like to say that. Like, we like to think, oh, okay, yeah, it's a rational process, and we have arguments that we've built, and we have alternatives that we've set up, and all that's true. There is a lot of rational thinking around negotiation, but humans are emotional. I mean, for example, we bring a lot of fear into our negotiations. So many people negotiate out of fear, and having fears isn't bad. I mean, all creatures have fears, right? It's what keeps us from running into the street. It's what keeps us often from doing really silly things. It's letting the fears dominate and define our behavior. That's when things get bad. And very often you find that the fears and the narratives are very closely related, because the fears come from what we're telling ourselves.
If you want more, why not go back and listen to the original full conversation with my guest? You will find the link in the episode in the show notes. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. And I'll be back next week with my long-form conversational episodes on Monday and the latest bite-sized episode on Friday. And have yourself a relaxing and rejuvenating weekend.